Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbley, and today I'm continuing the conversation on with Chris Abbott. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Tom. Nice to be back.
Wonderful. Wonderful to have a chance to chat with you. You emailed me a set of questions, and the first question I think was so emblematic of the reason that I started this podcast, I had to put it out there first. You asked me, what are you chasing when you write your own rules? Aren't there enough rules already? Would you like to give a preface to this question, or do you just want me to get into it?
I don't think there's much that I can add. I mean, there's so many game systems out there that each scratch a unique itch. And obviously, at some point in time, we've all said, gee, I like this game except for this one portion of it, and I could do something else. And I'm assuming that if you're heading down that path, that you've had the same thought. And I just wondered what was gnawing at the back of your mind on this.
If you'll allow me to digress, I gave a talk at NYU in 2000, and maybe it was 2000. I think it was midway through 2000. And these were graduate students at Douglas Rushkobb's, I don't know what it was. I guess it was some kind of media course at NYU. And I was talking about why I liked people using my Noble Ape simulation as a means of learning how to program. And in particular, that I'd get these, 15-year-old kids, 18-year-old kids contact me, and we're using my simulation to learn how to program and create their own programs, be it simulations, games, what have you. And the audience that I thought was intelligent people at the time, I think this audio is online somewhere, started chastising me for creating these kids that were, programming wasn't done in the US, thank you very much. Programming was done off in India. And what was the reason to teach these kids how to program? This was a skill that they didn't need to have because they could be perfectly good consumers of software like everyone else. Thank you very much. And my perspective is that whilst what you say is true, there are tens of hundreds, potentially even tens of thousands of rule systems out there, many of which are represented on my bookshelf as I look at it. But these things are not the reason that one would write one's own rule system. The Chechen rules that I've discussed periodically in this podcast, that I'm now delving more deeply into, are presenting a series of problems to me that would only present themselves in the function of writing a rule system. I'm exploring the history, I'm exploring the context of where funding came from. I'm looking at one side at the Chechen mafia, at the other side, literally Osama bin Laden in the late 90s started putting money into Chechnya. And I'm looking at this convergent soup of ideas, and what came out of it was originally a group of kids, nationalist kids, and then what it became is the war on terror. And through this transition, there were about maybe a year and a half, 2 years worth of these kids just getting together in bands and trying to remove the Russian military that had come in forcibly because the Chechens had declared independence, and the Russian military weren't going to have any of that because there were oil refineries in Chechnya. So in exploring all these things, I'm having an experience which you don't have when you play a game. I'm having an experience associated with resolving a system and creating a narrative which I can present to other folk where when they play the game, they will have a different experience again. But the essence of creating a rule set here is a different experience than actually playing a game. And I think what I want to identify to our listeners is that while we talk about the transition from playing rules into house rules, and sometimes writing your own rules don't have to be serious, it can be quite lighthearted, you can just be, messing with mechanics. But the experience of writing your own rules, the experience of creating a universe, the experience of having to answer questions which don't befall players typically as they play games, is a very unique experience and one that I think is well worth having. And while it is true that historically, like literally Tom age 5 to Tom age 7 played games, then Tom age 9 started writing his own rules, and then Tom age 11 started playing those rules, and then Tom was programming through that period of time, creating then simulation environments, early simulation environments in computer simulations, and continued to play games and write rules. This is a different kind of thing. And I think it's important to note to people who are considering writing their own rule set, and I think We're going to talk a little bit more about that, and certainly with Matthew Gibson, I'm going to talk more about that later this weekend. It's important to set the idea up that this isn't just a disgruntled player's experience. This is something more than that, and it relates to an intimacy with the subject matter that you won't get as a player. And if you feel that you're interested in exploring a subject matter with a greater degree of intimacy that you won't get as a player, then that is why you should create your own rule system. It is for that emotion. I was joking with my wife associated with this question. There is now a phenomena on YouTube of kids that just exclusively watch other kids play video games, even more passive than playing the video games that are created. There is now a greater passivity where you just watch other kids play video games. And I was talking with my co-workers that they actually have problems with their own children. Maybe it's not problems, but they observe their own children spending hours just watching other kids play. And how this is a kind of disturbing, meta relationship. Well, my perspective is part of this combating of this notion is actively getting involved in creating your own systems. And I think the experience of creating a rule set, I went back, I found a couple of books, I need to find a few more, of the rule sets that I actually created. One I wrote when I was 11, I think, was just so much detail, page after page after page after page of creating, hierarchies and orders, creating a financial system, doing all these things to a level of detail that really excited me as a boy. I don't have a lot of intimacy associated with remembering writing these rules, but to see them on paper is a very strange experience. And I think what interests me in recording this podcast is to put these ideas out for other people that might have a seed of this idea, or people that actually write their own rule sets. Because I think it's a distinctly different thing than just being a disgruntled game player. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, it does. I think I get where you're coming from. My follow-on question to this would be along the lines of how is developing a fully detailed setting, is that not sufficient? I mean, you could do a simulation of, say, the Chechen conflict or the Bosnia-Herzegovina issues that went on in the 80s. With you could use Twilight 2000 rule set, you could use Moral Project, you could use Recon, you could use any similar system that handled contemporary weapons and deal with the mechanical aspects, but you would still need to fully detail the war machine. That is to say, the organization, the equipment, give the background for the historical reasons for it happening. I mean, you could do all of the contextual stuff separate from the game system itself, like the mechanics of the system. But are you looking for to simulate something specifically with dice and paper that you can't get from an existing system? I think that's probably the root of my question.
So my perspective is that I was looking, for example, at, the Simbida rule sets because they cover the weapon systems. They cover some of the skill set, not the complete skill set, but they don't have a good mechanic associated with the movement between, I think of it as 3 points. You've got, independent kids, you've got really organized crime components, and then you have militant Islamic components, which are actually, and the Islamic components are actually incredibly formalized and part of a kind of cookie cutter. In fact, the notion of Chechen conflict became a kind of archetype within, bin Laden's, broad network as a means of translating what was a small nationalist struggle into, worldwide jihad. These rule systems don't contain nuances associated with where you get your money from, what skills you get through these things. You could write it, you could add it to, Simbida's rules, Twilight 2000, Recon, but the mechanics are not really there to describe what I want to do associated with a kind of life path trajectory. There are elements that I could copy, certainly through Recon, certainly some of the other Simbida rules. The other thing is, for deep RPG players, the potential is always there. I'm starting typically with a novice to, have played D&D periodically 20 years ago kind of audience.
Mm-hmm.
So I need to create something that is very well suited for the games night that I've created. And framing these deeper concepts, learning a completely different rule system. And let's talk a little bit about complexity here, because I think it's certainly my experience running these games has been complexity as a kind of double-edged sword. It needs to have relatively simple rules mechanics, but still follow a narrative path. And I think what concerns me with regards to the Recon rules, anything by Sabita, to a certain extent the Twilight 2000 rules, is that these are rule sets that people need to have a background knowledge of. The way that I play these games at work, even the D&D games, when you think, 5th edition D&D, I had players that came to the game and had never even picked up the player's handbook. We skilled them relatively rapidly. I have a really good kind of a backup crew that, brings in, creates characters, gives narrative, and kind of thrusts players out. And this is an element that I really like as well. And certainly the folks that do that, provide a lot of additional support and feedback. And they're very, they've started games of their own based on this interaction. So
Right.
I'm very knowledgeable of the people I play with and the skill sets that they have. But learning another rule system, and for me, I think by the time Sabita got the Recon rules, the Sabita rewrites of the Recon rules or the Palladium rewrites, are a movement towards, although the underlying stats aren't the Palladium metaverse, most of the mechanics are Palladium mechanics. The skill trees, a lot of the kind of narrative interactions, the weapons are taken straight from Palladium's other works.
Right.
To the point where I suspect I would have seen one of the Recon rule sets, but they were both very familiar to me because I had played and knew the Sabita, the Palladium rule sets coming up. And there was a lot of similar artwork and a bunch of interesting things. In fact, it was interesting moving from the advanced to the revised, whatever, the first one to the second one, temporarily. Right. Because, it was interesting seeing the transition between those rules. But this, again, is something that I don't want to burden my players with. I want an ability to take people who aren't deep RPG, nerd folk, but want to have a good game, want to have a narrative, want to have play mechanics that they can interact with, want some strategy, want some thinking, ultimately can be played while alcohol is consumed. We can talk about that a little bit as well. But at the same point, we'll get a full narrative experience. And I think those dynamics are relatively unique. And if I was dealing with people that you play with, if I was dealing with folks who were multi-rule versed and had a background of doing this for 20, 30, 40 years, it's a different group. So ultimately, I have to write the rules for the players in this circumstance.
Okay, so what side of the fence do you fall on with respect to universal rule systems? Then, like Steve Jackson's GURPS or Savage Worlds, Powered by the Apocalypse. Do you not see a place for a universal rule system where the setting is grafted onto the rules?
Well, I mean, that's great if you have an existing set of players with existing knowledge and a willingness to dig into that. I think the beauty of those systems is that people master those systems and then have different settings applied to those systems to give diversity. So it's not that these systems are bad per se. It's just they require a certain amount of mastery, usually through their existing scenarios, worlds, what have you, and then movement into other similar. So I think there's a degree of comfort that players will have that know these rule systems in just changing it to Chechnya. But what interests me with the potential of writing your own rule set is the nuances, the subtle nuances. And here I'm having to do a lot of reading. I'm really kind of being quite immersive, and I accidentally ordered a bunch of Russian material, which is very, very curious. You're getting far too far into a topic when you pick up some stuff and realize, hold it, wait, all of this is in Russian. Why wasn't I warned about this first? Anyway, moving on from that. So I guess the nuances that I want to capture here are associated with movement from kind of high school age kids into various forms of militancy, the recruiting from the high schools, the universities, And some of this comes from a wide variety of other reading as well around the Cuban Revolution, a bunch of other kind of where do you take militant intellectuals and, create them into guerrillas and this kind of stuff. So I have a lot of kind of nuanced reading background in this, but I think the dynamics in there are slightly different than just roll up this GURPS character and set them out in, Grozny. I mean, I think this is a different thing. I want to create a narrative history where the players ultimately learn a bit of history through it and appreciate the nature of what these kids went through and the experience that they had, which is, I think, slightly different. So the rules dynamics will be very much associated with heavy narrative early on and small mechanics to move in different directions. Obviously, means of funding, means of collecting weapons, means of gathering intelligence, a deep understanding of the history and the movement and the background, which is very, as you might have heard in my conversation with Matthew, difficult to map onto a contemporary American audience. But that's part of the nuance. And I don't think it would be feasible to say, here are, it's at least 3 GURPS rules sets that you need to go through to kind of get to a point where you can move to another thing. Similarly, Palladium, slightly fewer, but still additional weapons in some setting. Read through these rules, read these 400 pages, and then we can start playing this game in this fashion. Or maybe read just 100 pages, and then we can start playing this game. The complexity element associated with the page count is something that I'm looking to avoid here as well.
Yeah, I can see that. Are you taking this are you going to have a component in this game system where you're going to be simulating skirmishes with miniatures? Is there going to be a heavy use of miniatures in this game, or
I'm
is it?
Glad you asked.
The mind.
This game is inspired by a miniature line, and it's inspired by a miniature line that I backed the second Kickstarter of. It's sufficiently inspired by. We'll talk a little bit about miniatures later this evening, hopefully. But I've contacted the sculptor. I'm now friends with the sculptor of the miniature line on Facebook. I've explored his very diverse background work. I've been waiting for a set of Chechen miniatures, both Chechens and Russians here, to come out for many years. And this guy has a very particular style. I'm not sure if you saw the YouTube video of the unboxing.
I believe so.
He has a very particular whimsical style that captures certain elements. He's Russian, so he has a particular perspective on the conflict, obviously. But it's very interesting to see his expression of the conflict in miniature form. And each of the characters, each of the figures is incredibly characterful in terms of a wide variety of things. The what would be called stowage if it were a tank, but the collection of different bags and articles on each of them, weapons, pistols, rope, the kind of stuff that you'd want with dungeon adventuring miniatures. We'll get into miniatures a little bit later, but the kind of stuff that you love to see. Just a lot of different levels of detail on the characters. I think as you hold the individual miniatures, and certainly I'm looking for painters currently to capture certain elements of this, they have a very distinct feel to them. When I played the Just Plain Chaos rules at work, I used Victoria Lamb's Victoria miniatures. I'm not sure if you've seen them, but they're basically like various versions of Imperial Guard. They're Games Workshop heroic in stature, and the way in which I got a painter who no longer paints, unfortunately, to paint all these miniatures for me. And that created the theme of the game fundamentally. When I did D&D, I just did a black wash on white spray paint and then enameled. So all the characters in the D&D game were kind of ghost-like in appearance, but they had a rich character. I passed on all those miniatures to the players. So about 14 different people got half a dozen to a dozen miniatures each at the end of the game. Wow. So the aim is to create something that people would want to take away from. It's very much about framing some degree of complexity in an environment where people can take these things away. Certainly people with kids and what have you. I gave the books away from the D&D game to people with kids. And, it's about inspiring people in a very tangible way. If we will digress into the miniatures at some stage, I'll talk a little bit about that with miniatures specifically. But I think the range, which comes from Tiny Terrain, it's a British company, inspired the creation of this game. I've had a series of concepts of rules around this conflict for a while. It would be easy to port over the Just Plain Chaos rules to Chechnya, but I don't think I'll do that. Now, the more reading I've done, the more I've realized that the creation of these gangs, which basically became brigades and smaller, squads, what have you, that is a really curious story in and of itself. And it's actually, in some regard, a very familiar story. The addition of religion and these things is going to be interesting to play out. In fact, I've considered creating a game which is set in a parallel universe, let's say, not Chechnya specifically, but a world like Chechnya, because there are aspects of the religion which I think are very difficult to map onto contemporary American players. But there are certain subtle themes that I can convey without having to go too deeply into that. So I'm on the fence with that. Stay tuned for more. But yeah, the miniatures are critical.
Do you have a more up-to-date version of the Just Plain Chaos rules than the one you included in the feed for this podcast?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I froze the rules, and I was going to revise the grenade and shotgun rules, but I haven't done so, and there were issues in the rule set as well. But I thought after 2 or 3 games, I didn't want to be changing the rules on people continuously. It kind of broke it. So the rules as they are broken are the rules that we play when we get together. And I've kept it that way. Slightly too many dice rolls, few fumbling mechanics, but it's the rules as they are.
Fair enough. I know you had mentioned something about archetypes in the last time we spoke, and we really touched on the murder hobo as the primary one.
Yeah.
And I was reminded the other day that that's also known as a munchkin. Just kills everything in sight.
In certain circles. In Colorado, perhaps. Yes.
Oh, do you distinguish that archetype from, say, the power gamer who's out to min-max everything about their character and fully optimize every swing and every stroke?
So within the power gamer, there are 2 extremes. I think there's the power gamer that does that. They have certain munchkin qualities. The power gamer that I see is more someone who is exploring, has deep interest in certain rules mechanics and creates characters that manipulate certain rules accordingly. It's not necessarily about min-maxing. It's about finding something particularly curious, be they, a thief acrobat or what have you, a dragonborn, say no more. Mm-hmm. These kind of folk. Thankfully, what I try to do is, when these people appear, as they do, have roles and scenarios and things which challenge them and nurture them. And oftentimes the people that have the deep dive into the rules are the people that I put with new players more often than not. And not as a frustrating thing, but as a means that these are people that still probably have some gaps in the rule knowledge, but being next to a new player and having the responsibility of welcoming in a new player creates a different dynamic with their particular psychology. And thankfully, the work environment, while we have curious characters, do not let me deny this, the work environment tends to create a certain degree of normative behavior through some of these aspects. Now, if I was playing out in the wild, and you gave a bunch of examples associated with going to conventions and closed tables versus open tables and all this kind of stuff, in general, playing it at work affords me a huge number of luxuries. But the main thing is that the people that don't want to attend don't come back, and the people that do want to attend to continue to come back. And within that dynamic, there have been some interesting kind of political things that have gone on. We've had dominant of alpha male dynamics that we have to deal with. But within all of this, I try to find the archetype, find the challenge for the archetype, and just see how it plays out. And sometimes I need to change, subtle things. Like, for example, when we started 5th edition, I identified players who came in having had a solid knowledge of AD&D 2nd edition, for example, and wanted to do certain min-max strategies. They very quickly realized that my GMing style wouldn't allow that to happen. And in general, I was kind of hip to their game. I let them know I was hip to their game through subtle things that happen. So I'm very sensitive that of the archetypes that I'll describe, each of them doesn't have to be a caricature. And certainly through gameplay, my responsibility, in part as Games Master, is to identify that and stop it from being a caricature. Move them into spaces with problems where their archetypes are challenged and they can either resolve them and just be, the tank that goes in and mows everything down. That's just their role. That's what they're comfortable with. Or they can appreciate that I'm trying to cultivate some degree of growth and change out of them through the experience. And I think these kind of nuances are really fascinating and not really. I was reading the 5th edition, how to create a game scenario for, those that want to come to this thing and create, these games as friendly environments. The kinds of discussion that they have around that. And it's interesting actually reading what do you do in terms of conflict with players, kind of rules and discussions, because certainly Games Workshop has a big section on it in all their books. Slightly different in most, but still at least generally resolve it with dice rolls, resolve it with dice rolls. But it interests me that my history of doing this creates this circumstance. So 20 plus years of not playing games, coming back, I'm basically my 15-year-old self with 20 plus years worth of digital life experience, trying to work through these nuances accordingly. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, it does. Have you run into any circumstances? Well, you're trying to pair up the more experienced players with the newer players. Have you run into any problems where the more experienced players are actually trying to use the newer player's character as an adjunct to their own and more of the boss rather than the mentor?
I put the kibosh on that pretty. I mean, what I want is every new player, and this is interesting, particularly with like the Dragonborn player. What I try to do is give the new player the freedom to create or talk or think about what they want to create in a character in the process of handing them to the expert player. So that means that they kind of define themselves and feel comfortable with that. Now, in some circumstances, the more advanced player will say, no, you've got to do it this way or this way or this way. But usually the more experienced player is already experienced playing with me, is familiar with my play style as well. And they get a sense that what they're doing here is transitioning a new person into potentially a long-time playing companion. And using the new character and what's interesting here is using the new character as a foil, I think, is identified pretty quickly as being the wrong strategy in the kinds of games that are played, in particular because if that's occurring, I move around players in some circumstances. If that's occurring, I'll create scenarios. We haven't really talked about my kind of campaign scenario philosophy here, but I'll create things which move that around. But you've got to be cognizant of that. I can't think of any particular examples, mainly because the new player always has a huge amount of wonder. Like the new player either comes slightly skeptical, what is this smelly nerd pursuit? Or they're like, oh wow, new world, new possibilities, So I think the mind of the new player and the pairings of new player with more advanced player has to be in the broader kind of nuances of the game. And as many people, you used to listen to my conversations with Heronstone, as Heronstone would regularly point out, I live and work in a very rarefied, very created environment for these kind of broader, golden nerd people to interact. I appreciate that in the real world, when people are playing these games, particularly with groups that are self-selecting, they may not have the luxury that I have associated with workmates in a particular kind of environment. But I think there are still nuances. It's still a game. If the game is funky, if people are being killed instantly and it's just brutal and horrible and no one really wants to play the game, that's solely down to the games master, right?
I would say the majority is with the game master, but yes, the players are culpable in the game as well. They're participating in the consensual hallucination, as it were, right? So they're participating and they're writing the story as it goes on. But I know there's lots of situations where one player will become the dominant at the table, and they will start demanding things like seeing other people's character sheets to see what the stats are and what their equipment list is, and every little detail about what the other characters have. And I had a rather heated discussion with someone about them not seeing my character sheet under any circumstances. I said, I'll describe anything you want about the character, whether they look strong or they look like they have an intelligent expression on their face, or what they smell like, or what they're carrying on the outside of their clothes. But I'm not going to tell you anything else. I'm not going to tell you what their strength value is, or how many rounds they have of ammunition they're carrying, or what their schooling was, how they graduate. If that comes up in conversation during the role play, I might reveal that. But there are certain groups of people out there that want to command everything like it's some sort of competitive spreadsheet analysis.
Certainly.
And they got really upset about it. And I found that the conversation, as other people joined the conversation, it really divided quite quickly along the, you don't get to see my character sheet, or it's mandatory. And I don't think absolutism is a good thing, frankly, but
the sheet grabber is the real phenomenon. Certainly when I was a boy playing, I had one fellow who was a complete miscreant. It's actually interesting. I GM'd a group of, I must have been 12 at the time. I GM'd a group of 16-year-old girls and this one miscreant kid who was the younger brother of one of the girls. Of the women, I will now call them women, they all went on to do amazing things. Like, they're all professionally amazing in terms of, like, a director at Microsoft, head of the Bar Association at Georgetown University in the US. One's, an academic at Oxford. I mean, these... From this D&D game, I maintained connections with women that went on to do amazing things, but also this miscreant kid, who was the younger brother of one of them.
Right.
He destroyed rule sets. Like, he wasn't just a rules grabber, but he tried every possible means to, and there's a wide variety of psychological stuff associated with this thing, but yeah, he's one of the few people who has literally ripped up rule books that I've written in front of me. He grabbed, while we were playing this game with these women, which went on for a summer, it was a summer game over many afternoons, he did a wide variety of things that were, like, very strange, like stealing, like, maps that I had and things like that. Through this process, I changed the way I GM. I don't maintain much explicitly written down. I will write down a few numbers occasionally, usually which are either base 10, base 3, in some cases base 7, of the numbers that I'm actually thinking of, so they're basically meaningless to anyone that looks at them. And I changed the way I GM'd based on this kid's interaction with me. I became almost cryptographic associated with this experience. So I had to change the way I GM'd based on this. Thankfully, I've never had a rules grabber since. I've had a bad friend experience who came and stayed with me last year and was a violent alcoholic, and thankfully I didn't play any rules with him while he was here. Got him out very quickly. But so I have had bad experiences with these games and people with the games, but I've always modified the way I've behaved based on that. And now let me pour your character sheet kind of player. Thankfully, I don't really have that much problem with it. I also insist that players keep a bare minimum on their character sheet. Like, if you've got a life history, maintain that in your head. Don't document that in any way in a game. Come to the game. If you've got surprises in your life history in the game, play it out. Share if you want to, but, I think the maintaining everything, some people will, they'll keep a separate sheet of certain things, but yeah, I'm very much associated with, you present what you want to present. You don't have other people pouring. I mean, some players will give their character sheets to other folk because they're going to be away. They know they're going to be away next game night, and they're like, well, if you want to play my character, but usually they'll give them to me, and I'll just keep tallies on them accordingly. But from that one kid who just used to do a variety of vile things, I modified the way I GM, and I still GM with that method where I don't write anything down. I keep very minimalist maps. I learn maps prior to the game, which I think is really important. To maintain as much of the game as possible in your head is really something that I love about GMing, because within that you can recalculate and recalibrate far faster than if you're looking at 15 different points in a module. Anyway.
I did recall seeing a note about someone who is apparently a professional DM for hire.
Mm.
They will run games for you, but they had stated that they don't read the adventures ahead of time if they're a prepared adventure, and they don't necessarily take a lot of time to learn the rule sets prior to running if you've got a particular game in mind.
Mm.
And frankly, if you can't be bothered as a professional to take the care to read ahead and have some sort of sense of how everything flows together, rather than stuttering and stammering through your box text during a game, I don't get it. I mean, the whole thing for being a GM is the prep to me.
Mm-hmm. Without question,
you're delving into the most meaningful facets of what you've created and trying to breathe some sort of life into that for the players. And if you're not going to at least read ahead before a game, even if you only spend an hour before a game session to look at what the players are likely to encounter over the next few hours, I don't get it. I don't know if you can call yourself a GM. I mean, you can just feed it into feed a scanned version of the document into the Windows text to speech generator. You don't need it if they're not going to read ahead and they don't have anything planned out. I'm lucky I haven't had a situation where somebody's torn up a rule book in front of me. I have had people tear up character sheets and maps. I have had various writing implements chucked about the room, but and dice, of course, dice in the room. One die that refused to roll decently one night got a hammer, split right in half, a 20-sider, and shattered off a big portion of it. Wasn't me that did it, but he'd had enough.
Yes. After
failing multiple rolls. I mean, you're talking about not people even that are rules lawyers, but they're aggressive about not getting their own way in the game. And I think that's past any sort of solution that the average GM can come up with to integrate them into the game system. If it doesn't matter what the rules say, they want to do something that's either not covered or they're not skilled enough to do, or they failed the rules to do it and won't accept no for an answer.
Yes.
I'm not keen on that sort of player at a table. But when you're at a con, you quite frequently don't know who you're going to get, either as fellow players or as players in your game you're GMing. You're at the mercy of the four winds there.
Yes, I have very limited experience with that, so I can't really talk too much to it. As we have a limited time frame, I did want to touch on miniatures, if we could.
Yes, by all means.
Because I have identified in adult life that I have a particular addiction to miniatures. I think once I've identified that, I can then stipulate certain rules, particularly as a married man. This is very good. You have to stipulate certain rules.
The first step in solving the problem is admitting you have one. I think that's the...
Yeah, except I'm not doing the Alcoholics Anonymous thing because I'm not going cold turkey. But I do apologize to people who I've slighted through miniature purchases. But so, for me, miniatures are multifaceted. I think they're so deeply ingrained in my psyche that it's actually very difficult to talk about them in theoretical terms. Bar to say, when I was doing the D&D game at work initially, I knew the line I needed to buy. It was a Black Tree design. I think it's called Erosis now, but if you search for Black Tree design, you can see the miniatures. Many characterful, all metal miniatures, a variety of different, elements, be they dwarves, elves, orcs, what have you, goblins, aplenty. So I knew the line that I wanted to buy. I knew the kind of stuff that I was aiming for there. For me, I have limited myself to particular metal miniatures, a particular era. I really like the early Citadel miniatures just at the point of slaughter base. Some of the pre-slaughter bases are interesting, but they suffer from lead rot. But the main thing for me is also finding painters as well. And this is something that I got into very heavily when I was in the UK and then stopped for more than a decade. In fact, I've only started commissioning painters since I did another podcast called Attic Aficionados and went up into my attic and brought down a box. I actually filmed it on YouTube, so you can go to YouTube and find the video footage. And opened up the box and found these miniatures that were 12 plus years old that had been painted by this fellow called Kirill Kennev primarily, but also a fellow called Willie Winter, Chris Blair, Justin Fred Reed, who did a majority of my miniatures. Just saw the immense attention to detail and the beauty within these little things and realized that this was still something that was part of my life. Now, I'd purchased miniatures in between. I had purchased various bits and pieces. But the returning to painting and employing these painters and then going through a group of painters and working out which I wanted to continue to employ and all these kind of things was just so rewarding, for a better term, that I had to put certain restrictions on myself. I have a very tight miniature budget. I have a very tight miniature painting budget. I do a lot of correspondence with these folk. I maintain about 7 miniature painters, I think 7 currently, and they do different work for me, and they do it all very slowly. So I basically set up a year's worth of painting projects with them and then wait periodically and get periodic photos and these kind of things. But for me, the hobby of miniatures is so deep and different that it's hard to actually talk about it in the context of even wargaming, because I think it's something that is supportive but distinctly different than all these things. And miniatures are useful without question in, playing games, even board games, miniatures are useful. But they represent something distinctly different to me that is multifaceted, and while I can describe, it may not be appropriate for this kind of discussion. So, yeah, I have a particular fascination, and I think it's important to remember the history. I know many of the early sculptors, and I have learnt a lot of the history of the various miniature companies, where the molds went, all this kind of stuff. And I don't know that knowledge is necessarily practical, but it's just something that I love to maintain. Where do you stand with miniatures, Chris?
About 25 millimeters high. Miniatures are interesting to me. I mean, that was part of what drew me in the first day I got into the gaming. There were miniatures on the table, and they weren't the toy soldier miniatures. They were fantasy figures, most definitely. It was no one was with a rifle. It was swords and shields and spell casting paraphernalia. And so I bought quite a few back in the day at the local hobby shop, one out of a pack. They were relatively cheap, all things considered. We could usually get them for $1, $1.25, maybe $2 and change for a mounted figure. But I like them, even if we're not playing a serious game where we're taking into account range, line of sight, area of effect, like we're not in combat. I still like to have them on the table to show the marching order, I guess would be the phrase. And I have found, and luckily, I have found the minis that I had when I was 15 years old, so 37 years ago. And some of them are painted well. I can't believe that I did them with no glasses and no magnification. The detail level is quite high on some of them, and very, very thrilled to have them back. Also found a pile of them that I'd purchased back in the day that were never, ever painted or had a primer coat on them. And we used pretty much exclusively, testers or Humbrol enamels with terps as a thinner. I don't think I'll be doing that again. I think I'm going to go with the Vallejo or MIG paints, the acrylics in the bottles. And I'm sort of leery of even starting to paint again because my eyesight is considerably worse than it was all those years ago. I did find one of the things I really wanted back in the day were 15 millimeter figures for Traveler, snapshot and highlighting stuff like that. And there just weren't any available in the area. And having lead shipped in the mail was not something I could really afford to do. But I discovered very recently that RAFM, who made a lot of the Traveler minis back in the day, all their molds are within spitting distance of my place. They're a little town just southwest of me, and where the Silver Fox company is now producing Traveler minis. So they had an anniversary sale on, and I bought about 10 or 12 bags of Traveler minis. So 120 or 150 figures. And they're staged up, ready to do something with. I also noted the new Reaper minis, the plastic ones that were so popular from a Kickstarter a few years ago. They look tremendous, but they're really kind of fragile, and they take a shape and take a set and stay that way. So they get kind of deformed quite quickly, and I'm not sure how to correct that. I'm sure if somebody's going to send me an email about it. Battletech, very cool. Iron Wind Metals has some really cool Battletech figures that can be posed in a lot of ways. And I've probably got a dozen of those ready to go. And I think I've mentioned the Test of Honor Samurai miniatures game. I ended up getting the core set and 3 or 4 expansions. They're mostly plastic figures, which are completely posable, torso, legs, arms, heads. And there's probably another 100 or so of those to do. And I'm just I made a paint booth. I've got an exhaust fan set up, and I almost have room to do it. I just haven't managed to get around to it. But I love minis. I think they're a terrific visual cue for a game. They can slow down play. Really, depends on what you want to do. We've done a lot of Call of Cthulhu scenarios and Traveler scenarios with minis on multiple decks of a ship, and that to keep track of where everything is and who's involved and all the antagonists and protagonists in the scenario. That's invaluable, because trying to do that in theater of the mind, once we get past a dozen, maybe 10 players in a game or participants in the melee, I lose track, and then it's up in the air. But I did have a question about minis for you.
Mm-hmm.
This is an easy one. Squares or hexes?
Oh,
what's your preference? Squares or hexes?
My perspective is that the history of the miniature defines whether it's on a square or a hex. I got a couple of hobgoblins recently. I think I unwrapped them actually on my YouTube channel, Monty's Reviews. They have hex bases. They're hex miniatures. Like, it's very easy. Now, obviously, there's crossover at some point. Some miniature blisters, when you break them open, will have both hexes and squares, and some will even have round bases together.
Right, but the map itself is squares or hexes.
Oh, I think it depends on setting. My view is that if you're moving great distances, it has to be hexes. That's the only way that it's fair.
Flank facing,
But you have games like Colditz, Escape from Colditz, where everything is hexes, and that's for regular movement as well. So I would let the miniature define their choice associated with the squares or hexes. But in play, I think, ideally no grid. No grid at all.
Oh, okay.
Like measure move, wargaming style, classic wargaming style. I do that with all my games that are played accordingly. I think that's squares and hexes really are artificial in that context. I think if you're dealing with, great distance movement and what have you, hexes in description, but again, you can move nuancedly within those areas without actually reverting to, quantized integer movement, let's just say. So, neither in general. We'll talk a little bit, perhaps, at a future recording about board games and these kind of problems where it really is squares or hexes. But in general movement, no, just a measuring tape.
I don't know when it came about, but I noticed in 5e D&D that it's all squares, and they're 5-foot squares, which threw me off initially.
Yeah,
because
I didn't play that. I just used the measuring tape. I'm not going to play. My view with that is, although no, I didn't use any of those. I just use the measuring tape. Let's do proper distances, and let's, that whole thing is very curious. You're playing chess then. Chess is a different game. So I hope I answered that.
Well, yeah, I know. There's lots of people that have expressed a preference for using a grid base, just because it simplifies some of the calculations for them, right? It's a simple, I'm counting off five for my movement, and the area of effect is going to be 3 squares from the center of this spell going off, or this grenade, or some other explosive.
But if you have a measuring tape in your hand, you could do all of that, and you just pass the measuring tape around. I don't think it slows anything down. I mean, the dungeons that are created, the Dwarven Forge dungeons that are created, have squares implicitly, but I would not ask a player to, step forward 5 squares through that. No, just cast a measuring tape. Move how many inches in any direction you want.
I think it might be a comfort thing for some people.
Perhaps,
I'm not
yes.
sure. I'm happy either way. Bits of string at 12 paces, I'm fine.
Very good.
So,
do we have enough time to discuss or touch on stores, or should we call it a night?
Well, on brick and mortar stores, I don't know if there's anything much to say anymore. Like, all the places I used to shop, with very few exceptions, are all gone. There used to be a joke about the Toronto Triangle, like the Bermuda Triangle,
mm-hmm.
and there were so many stores in that zone. Silver Snail Comic Shop, Four Horsemen, the Battered Dwarf, Dragon Lady Comics, and virtually all Games a Lot. I can't leave out Games a Lot,
mm-hmm.
because I actually worked for them at one point in time.
Mm-hmm.
That was an interesting retail experience. We did parlor games, board games, role-playing games, comics, and it was a madhouse, especially at Christmas time. But virtually every single one of those vendors disappeared. Like if they all opened in the same area and they all disappeared in the same area at slightly different times. And now it's very, very difficult to walk into a shop and find role-playing games on the shelf. You might find board games on the shelf in a generic store, but RPGs, very rare. I have to, as a caveat, we actually have a store in town, in my small town here, that is an RPG collectible card game, comic, and board game shop. But that's so rare. There's hardly any unless I go right into the city, and there's only probably 2 or 3 in the whole of the greater Toronto area that I could say this is a game store. But online, holy crap.
Let me tell you an amusing anecdote. I came to this part of the world in 2010 with my brother, who had never been to the US before, and I was returning. I'd come to give a talk in 2009, but it really was back here in 2010. We stayed in 5 different locations, and my brother said to me after the 3rd location, "You're just picking hotels right next to game stores." And I said, partially, but the density of game stores in the greater San Francisco Bay Area is greater than any other place in the world that I've ever been to, including, I think, just based on density that I've been able to map, Greater London. And within this, I'm sure I'll get London listeners complaining about that. Within this, over the 9 years now, so when my alcoholic former friend came to stay with me last year, we did just the East Bay of game stores. We started up with games at Berkeley, and we finished down at Game Castle Fremont. We had 4 stores in between those points. The density of stores, while they've changed, while some of them, Games at Berkeley, for example, is not the game store it was 3 years ago. They've changed location, they've changed owners. It's a poor shadow of its former self, but it still exists. There was a game franchise which had disappeared in the North Bay and still has an offering in Oakland. I think they still have an offering in Santa Rosa. But the San Francisco Bay Area has more game stores than I think anywhere else in the world. And it is, out of the 3 reasons I moved to the Bay Area, the only real reason that's maintained itself through this period of time. That being said, there is no such thing as utopia. All these game stores have their own problems. I do have favourites, but they all have their own issues. And sometimes it comes down to the owners. Sometimes there's a store pretty close to me called Legends Comics and Games, the Santa Clara one. I like the one that's in Aptos or Santa Cruz. I like that one. But the one in Santa Clara, I used to buy miniatures from the guy online on eBay that runs this store. It's actually gone out of business, I think. And I went in there, the last 2 times I went in there to buy stuff and actually left the store without buying stuff. The guy annoyed me enough. And my experience with these stores is different in each of the stores. And there are some good stores where I know I can go for specific things, but none of them are perfect. Some are much better than others. The Game Castle franchise, I think, in the South Bay is amazing. And in general, they have a location in Mountain View. Mountain View is one of the more affluent areas of the Bay Area. They have a gymnasium, literally a gymnasium-size store, which is 4/5 game tables. So there are about 30 plus, I can show you photos online, you can find photos online of this. There are about 30 plus game tables. Any given weekend, they are packed with people. The San Francisco Bay Area is unique, I think, in terms of the quality of the game stores and also in terms of the fact that all of them tend to be packed. And it's something, there's a strong middle class in the San Francisco Bay Area, obviously, but it is such a unique area because of that. And while some of the stores change hands and change certain things, you have to be on your A game here because the density is such that people will move. And if your game store isn't providing for the local community, you'll find pretty swiftly that people just won't be there. But there are some pretty amazing game stores here. And I'm really, one of the things, like I said, one of the three reasons I moved here that's actually maintained itself is the quality of game stores here. And I'm really, really very lucky. That being said, I'm also a recluse, so I rarely get to the game stores. But when I can, I do. And I do really love them. And I'm sure to drop reasonable coin in each of them just because I think it's incredibly important to maintain these local hubs in a community. And I buy stuff and they always give me lots of freebies as well, which is one of the difficulties of these stores, is that they really are really very humble associated with how they deal with the general public as well. So, yeah, the Bay Area, we are just absolutely spoiled. And in terms of local podcasts, there are a couple of local podcasts that actually run out of game stores here. Carl Turtle, who does Independent Characters podcast. There are these podcasts that are actually out of these game stores as well. So, yeah, it is a vibrant and amazing community in the Bay Area and really nurtures for each of the areas, whether it be a mainly student population, whether it be a mainly, adult, the father-son, the deltas that you see in some of these stores is just amazing. And the general dynamics is just extraordinary. And even these are all independent stores. We then have 4 Games Workshop stores that are really hard pressed. I mean, they're also, don't get me wrong, they're also packed. But when you have these amazing independent game stores that have been operating for 40 plus years in most cases, yeah, it really is a phenomena here. And I think if any of our listeners ever come to the San Francisco Bay Area, pack half your suitcase. Brace yourself. Now, my favorite used to be Games of Berkeley because they had such a deep, old rules area. A quarter of the store was devoted to rules going back 30 years. And you'd come in because there was a constant turnover of people just recycling stuff. Unfortunately, the new owners, they've got a large marble collection and a bunch of new bright, shiny box games. They kind of lost that when they changed locations. But, the Oakland store, which I think is what is it called? There's a store in Oakland, very close to the train station in Oakland, that still has a great secondhand section. They have a secondhand rules room. That's well worth it. But yeah, there are just some amazing stores here. So I wanted to conclude on a happy note and say we have so many topics left to cover here, Chris.
Yes.
So for folks listening in, please give your email address.
I can be reached at rpgfan@bell.net. That's rpgfan@bell.net. Bravo Echo Lima.net.
Very good, Chris. And I am available at Bravo Alpha Romeo Bravo Alpha Lima Echo Tango @gmail.com. There's something about this podcast, Chris. It's a word of mouth podcast. You've experienced model rail radio. You're experiencing the early days of My Rules Are Better. Can you talk a little bit about the word of mouth phenomenon?
It's very, very difficult to to countenance. I don't understand how the word gets out. I noticed there were 3 reviews on the iTunes website in the U.S. already for the podcast. I didn't see any on the Canadian or UK sites, but it gets around. It's surprising how the audience builds up very quickly if there's any engagement in their set sphere. It's difficult to.
It's late night. Let me take over. If you're enjoying listening to this podcast, the way to continue this podcast is to tell your friends about it. The ability to create these things with no sponsors and just random dudes talking about stuff, which clearly you're enjoying because you've gotten to the end of the podcast, indicates that this podcast has an existence that maybe needs a little bit of nurturing. Your role as the listener is to tell your friends about this podcast, but also to get involved with the podcast. So to join the podcast Facebook group, to email Chris, to email me, to send in topics. If you want more expansion about various ideas, listener Mike King said he was going to email a series of topics in. I have not yet heard from listener Mike King. I'm going to shout him out in this podcast. But this podcast is obviously people who participate in the podcast, but also listeners who can actively participate. So please, if you like this stuff, pass the audio on to your friends, pass the URL on to your friends, join the Facebook group, get involved with the discussion, and participate in this thing that is My Rules Are Better. Chris Abbott, it has been an absolute pleasure chatting with you this evening. I am going to be a day away from leaving for the UK next week. I think, pending no weather, storms, furnaces burning out, this kind of stuff, we might be able to chat. I'm not sure if I'll get the audio out before I leave for the UK, but if you're available this time next week, it would be wonderful to have the chance to chat with you.
I will make every effort to be available, Tom.
I'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Take care.